My name is Claire Harmon. I am 32 years old. My father spent 2 years calling every employer in Caldwell County, Virginia, and telling them his daughter had been dishonorably discharged from the United States Army for theft. And when that lie still wasn't burning fast enough, he filed a formal written complaint with my commanding officer, trying to end the military career I had spent 8 years building with an honorable record. All because I turned down his offer to work at his real estate firm for free. I spent nearly a decade coordinating military budgets and managing multi-million-dollar contracts for Army installations, earning every single bar on my uniform through precision, loyalty, and a level of discipline my family never bothered to understand. I believed that separating as a captain in the Army Finance Corps would mean returning home to Caldwell County with a resume that spoke for itself, a career that I had built with my own hands and my own sweat, far away from the shadow of the family name. Instead, I returned to a world where my father, Dale Harmon, 63 years old, the founder of Harmon Commercial Properties, the firm whose name was on half the commercial buildings in Caldwell County, had already written the ending of my story before I even crossed the county line. He was a man who understood better than anyone that in a small Virginia community, the person who controls the real estate and the development board controls the narrative. And he had spent 30 years making sure he controlled both with a grip that never loosened. I remember the first Sunday dinner after I moved back into my old room, the air in the dining room feeling as heavy and still as it had when I was 18. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, passing the roast beef and clearing empty side dishes, while the entire conversation orbited exclusively around my brother, Kevin Harmon, 36 years old, the vice president of my father's company. The son my father had been building towards something since Kevin could hold a set of blueprints and listen without interrupting. My father didn't look at me when he spoke. He directed every word of his legacy speeches to the son who had never spent a single night away from home or a single day earning a paycheck that didn't have the family name on it. I sat there in a silence I had been practicing since I was a little girl. A silence that felt different now that I knew what it was like to lead soldiers and manage government audits. I kept thinking, I have been responsible for the financial readiness of an entire battalion, and yet here I am just the daughter who is expected to pass the gravy and wait for her turn to be useful in a way that serves my father's pride. Most of us who grew up in families where the men decided what the women were worth know that feeling. The quiet, heavy realization that your achievements aren't seen as successes, but as inconveniences to the order of the house. My mother, Ruth Harmon, 58 years old, a woman who had built an entire life around knowing exactly when to let the room stay quiet, caught my eye once as she topped off my father's sweet tea. And I saw a flash of something that looked like pity before she looked away to adjust the lace centerpiece. She had spent 35 years learning that the cost of disagreeing with my father was higher than the cost of her own dignity, and she had long ago accepted that her daughter would eventually have to learn the same lesson, no matter how many bars I wore on my shoulders. I realized then that my 8 years of service and the finance corps credentials I carried in my briefcase were nothing more than a temporary distraction in my father's eyes, a phase he was waiting for me to outgrow so I could finally become the unpaid office administrator he had planned for me to be. The dynamic of my family has always been a ledger of perceived debts and calculated control. I remember when I was still in ROTC and my parents gave me a credit card for what they called necessary expenses while I was away at my advanced accounting courses. I was 22, and I used that card exactly once to buy a set of specialized advanced finance textbooks and a graphing calculator that cost $1,200, items I needed to finish the degree that was going to be my ticket to a commissioned officer rank and a life of my own. I stood in the hallway that night and listened to my father scream at my mother about my reckless spending, claiming I was a thief who was draining the family's resources, even though I had already taken a part-time job at the campus library to pay the balance back. I paid every cent of that money back within 3 months, and I kept the bank receipts in a folder I still carry in my car today. But my father never cared about the receipts or the truth of the repayment. He only cared about the story he could tell, and he had been telling that story to every influential person in Caldwell County for over a decade, sowing the seeds of theft and unreliability that he would later use to harvest my future. When I started applying for civilian accounting jobs in town, I didn't understand why the interviews always ended with the same polite, cold dismissal. The hiring manager's eyes shifting toward the window, the sudden loss of interest in my military commendations, and the predictable form email 2 days later saying they had decided to go in a different direction. I had a CPA license, a master's in finance, and a distinguished service record, but none of it mattered because my father had already made his rounds at the country club and the Chamber of Commerce. He had sat in those same offices, leaning back in his chair and telling his friends that he was doing his best with a troubled daughter, a girl who had problems with honesty, even back in college, and a soldier who hadn't really left the army with the record she claimed to have. He waited until I was down to my last few $100s, until the weight of the rejection felt like a physical pressure in my chest, before he finally called me into his study to offer me a chance at redemption that was really just a life sentence of submission. The only reason I didn't say yes to my father in that study, the only reason I didn't let that cage door click shut right then, was because I kept hearing my grandmother's voice in the back of my mind, a quiet, steady hum that had been there since I was a little girl. My grandmother, Eleanor Marsh, 78 years old when she passed, the woman who had built Marsh Regional Supply from a single loading dock in Roanoke back in 1974, was the only person in my family who ever looked at me and saw something that wasn't a problem to be managed. She was a woman of sharp angles and practical silences, someone who had spent decades walking warehouse floors and staring down bankers who thought a woman in distribution was just a temporary fluke of the economy. I spent every summer at her house in Roanoke, away from the manicured lawns and the suffocating expectations of Caldwell County, learning that a person's worth wasn't something granted by a father's approval, but something built, brick by brick, through the work of your own hands. Her house always smelled like lavender sachets and the sharp, honest scent of dark roast coffee that seemed to be brewing from the moment the sun touched the porch. I remember sitting at her Formica kitchen table while she reviewed inventory ledgers and shipping manifests, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, her hands steady as she moved a yellow highlighter over the numbers that represented her independence. She always had a mug of Folgers waiting for me on the counter before I even walked into the room, steam rising in the morning light, a quiet ritual that said I was welcome without either of us having to say a single word. It was the kind of unremarkable, steady love that I didn't realize was keeping me whole until I was much older. The kind of love that doesn't demand anything in return and doesn't ask for a receipt. I think most women who have raised families or built something from nothing know that feeling. That silence isn't always an absence of thought, but a sanctuary where you keep the things that are too important to be spoken aloud in a house full of men who are always listening for a weakness. Anyone who has watched a parent get older knows how quickly the people around them start treating them like they are no longer the person they used to be, as if age is a fog that erases the business empire they built or the decades of wisdom they earned. My father always spoke about my grandmother as if she were a sentimental old woman who had gotten lucky in a different era. But I saw the way her jaw tightened when he would dismiss her opinions at Thanksgiving. And I saw the way she watched him when he thought no one was looking. One afternoon, when I was 15, and we were sitting on her back porch watching the fireflies dance over the bluegrass, she took my hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong and told me that knowledge was the only thing no one could ever take away from me. She told me that she had already prepared for my future in ways I wouldn't understand for a long time, and that when the day came that I felt like I had no air left to breathe in my father's house, I should remember that she had already built me an escape route. I didn't understand what she meant then. I was a teenager who thought the army was going to be my only way out. But I remember the way she looked at the rolling hills of Virginia and said that a man like my father never stops wanting more, and that the only way to survive him was to be invisible until the moment you were ready to be heard. 3 years ago, when we buried her, my father told us that she had left everything to charitable foundations and scholarship funds, leaving only small symbolic gifts for her grandchildren because she believed we needed to learn the value of $1. I had been deployed at the time, hearing the news over a satellite phone in a shipping container office, and I had believed him because I was too exhausted to imagine that he would lie about a dead woman's last wishes. I stood there in my fatigues, miles away from home, and felt the last tether to my sense of belonging snap, believing that even the woman who loved me most had decided I didn't need her help. I realize now that my grandmother was playing a much longer game than I could have ever imagined. A game that required her to let my father believe he had won, while she was quietly moving the pieces into place behind a curtain of legal trusts and private accounts. She knew that if she left me anything directly, anything that my father could see or touch, he would find a way to claim it was for my own good or manage it into his own investment portfolio. So she stayed quiet, letting him believe he was the master of our family's real estate empire, while she sat in her house in Roanoke and wrote letters to people my father didn't even know existed. I spent those 3 years after her death feeling like I was drifting, anchored to nothing but my military service, never realizing that the only person who truly saw me had already ensured that I wouldn't have to stay a captain in a world where my father held all the keys to the civilian sector. It wasn't until I found myself standing in my tiny, rented apartment in the Caldwell outskirts, staring at the final notice from my utility company, that I began to wonder if the silence my grandmother kept was actually a shield. My father's offer in the study, the one where he promised to make the rumors about my dishonorable discharge go away if I just came home, felt less like a lifeline and more like the final turn of a lock. I knew that if I stepped back into that house on Magnolia Lane, if I sat at that table and accepted the mercy of a man who had spent 2 years poisoning the ground I walked on, I would never be the woman my grandmother saw when she looked at me across that kitchen table. I had to believe that there was something left of her, something more than just the scent of lavender and the memory of black coffee. Because if I didn't, the only thing waiting for me was the slow, quiet erasure of everything I had spent my life trying to become. I spent those first 4 months back in Caldwell County moving through the world like a person who was already fading away. A finance officer who had managed the pay and benefits for thousands of soldiers, but who was now becoming invisible in the very town that had raised me. I stayed quiet for longer than I should have, telling myself that the cold stares at the grocery store and the way the local bank tellers suddenly found something else to do when I approached were just a series of strange misunderstandings, a temporary glitch in the life I was trying to rebuild. I think most of us who grew up in families like mine know what it means to keep your mouth shut. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you have spent a lifetime learning that speaking the truth costs more than you are prepared to pay. And I spent those months paying that debt in silence, while my father carefully dismantled the one thing I had left that he hadn't given me: my reputation. I told myself I was protecting the family name, that I was being the bigger person by not fighting back against the whispers I didn't fully understand yet. But that silence was a trap I set for myself, a sanctuary of denial that allowed my father to move from poisoning my job applications to poisoning the very ground I stood on. My father didn't just stop at telling accounting firms that I was a thief. He reached into the most sacred part of my identity, the 8 years of service that I had worn like a shield, and he twisted it until the community saw it as a mark of shame. He began telling the Chamber of Commerce board members and the veterans of foreign wars leadership that I hadn't left the Army honorably, but that I had been dishonorably discharged for financial irregularities that were too sensitive for him to discuss in detail. In a town like ours, where the flag flies on every porch and military service is the highest form of community standing, that lie was more than a smear. It was a social execution, a way to ensure that even the people who didn't want to hire me would no longer want to sit next to me at a Friday night football game or a potluck dinner. I was a captain who had been trusted with government millions, but my father was telling everyone I was a disgrace to the uniform, and he was doing it with that particular brand of fatherly grief that made everyone feel sorry for him for having to carry the burden of a daughter like me. The weight of that lie finally hit me on a Sunday afternoon in October, during a church social on the lawn of the First Baptist, where the smell of fried chicken and sweet tea usually felt like a homecoming. But that day, it felt like an interrogation. I saw a woman who had taught my Sunday school class for 7 years, someone who used to send me care packages during my first deployment, and who I had always considered a second mother, standing by the dessert table with a plate of lemon bars. I walked toward her with a smile, ready to tell her about my plans to move to Richmond. But as soon as our eyes met, her expression went from familiar warmth to a cold, hard distance that I had never seen before. She didn't wait for me to speak. She simply tucked her purse under her arm and turned her back on me, walking away to join a group of women who all suddenly found the centerpiece arrangements fascinating enough to avoid looking in my direction. The woman who had taught my Sunday school class for 7 years turned her back and walked the other way when I said hello. And I understood then that my father hadn't just called the employers. He had told everyone in that county that his daughter was someone to be ashamed of, a soldier who couldn't be trusted. If you've ever had a moment where you realized the people who were supposed to protect you had been the ones doing the most damage all along, tell me if this sounds like someone you know. Like and subscribe. Because what I found inside my Army separation paperwork 3 weeks after that destroyed any last hope I had that I was misreading what he had done. I stood there on that manicured grass, the sound of the church bells ringing in the distance, and the only thought I had was that if these people believed I was a disgraced soldier, then my father had already won the war before I even knew we were fighting. I realized that my honorable discharge certificate, the one framed in my trunk, was just a piece of paper in a town where my father's lies carried the weight of divine law, and that my silence hadn't been an act of maturity. It had been an act of surrender. I looked across the lawn and saw my brother Kevin standing with a group of local developers and checking his latest model iPhone, looking every bit the heir apparent that my father had groomed him to be, while I was becoming a pariah in the only home I had ever known. My father was at the center of another circle, his hand on a county supervisor's shoulder, the image of a grieving, dignified patriarch who was handling a family tragedy with grace. And I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me that I had never felt, even during the worst audits in the finance corps. That evening, I went back to my apartment and sat on the floor, surrounded by the boxes I hadn't fully unpacked because I was still waiting for my life to start. And I began to understand the true scale of the blacklist my father had constructed. It wasn't just about the Caldwell County jobs. It was about my standing in the community, my veteran status, and the very air I breathed in this town. All of it being slowly choked off until the only option left would be to go back to Magnolia Lane and beg for a seat at his table. He wanted me to be so gutted by the rejection of the community that I would forget I was a commissioned officer who knew how to fight back. And he almost succeeded because I had been so busy trying to be a good daughter that I had forgotten how to be a soldier. But as I stared at the utility bill that I couldn't pay and thought about the way that woman had turned her back on me, I realized that if I was going to survive, I had to stop being invisible and start finding the paper trail that my father thought he had buried under 10 years of real estate contracts and country club handshakes. I went back to that basement records office the next morning, the fluorescent lights humming with a sound that felt like it was drilling into my temples, and I pulled out the manila folder where I kept my Army separation paperwork, the documents I had handled with such care because they were the only proof I had that I had spent 8 years becoming someone my father couldn't claim credit for. I found a document I had overlooked in my initial shock, a formal inquiry notice on Army Inspector General stationery, detailing a written complaint filed by my own father during my final months of active duty at Fort Bragg. He hadn't just whispered to the neighbors. He had reached into the military's administrative chain to claim that his daughter, an Army finance captain, had mismanaged government assets to cover personal debts within the family. An act so calculated that it was designed to trigger an investigation and strip me of my security clearance before I even had the chance to transition to the civilian sector. I sat there on the cold linoleum floor and realized that my father, Dale Harmon, had been trying to burn my bridge to the future while I was still standing on it, using the very finance degree he had once called a waste of money as proof that I was a high-level risk to any financial institution that might think of hiring me. I think most of us who grew up in families where the truth is just a tool for control know that feeling. When you realize that the person who raised you has spent months, maybe years, documenting your life as a series of failures just to make sure you never have the strength to leave. I had stayed quiet for far too long, telling myself that if I just worked hard enough at this county records job, if I just showed him I could survive on minimum wage, he would eventually see that I was no longer the little girl he could scare into submission. But my silence had only given him the room he needed to turn his control into a strategic business plan. And I found the final piece of that plan late that afternoon while I was restocking notary supplies in the storage closet that shared a wall with the building's ventilation hub. I heard voices drifting through the metal grate, the sound of my father's, mixing with the voice of a man I recognized as a lead developer from a rival firm. The very company my father had been trying to outmaneuver for a decade in the Caldwell County bidding wars. I was sitting on the floor of a supply closet, surrounded by file boxes, when I heard my father's voice traveling through the ventilation duct and explaining to another man that his daughter had run out of options, that she would do what she was told, and that the two of them should talk numbers because a business merger could be sealed by a marriage he had already begun to plan. If you have ever sat somewhere quiet and listened to someone you were supposed to trust discuss your future like it was something to be negotiated without you, tell me if you would have stayed quiet as long as I did. Like and subscribe, because the letter I had found in my Army paperwork the week before told me he had already tried to reach into my military service and pull the same lever he had used on every employer in that county. I leaned my head against the cold metal of the vent, my breath hitching in my chest as I listened to them discuss my life like it was a zoning permit or a commercial lease that just needed the right signature to be finalized. My father was telling this man that I was stable enough now, that the Army trouble had been handled, and that once our families were joined through a marriage alliance with his son, the Harmon development footprint would be untouchable across the entire state of Virginia. I realized then that my brother, Kevin Harmon, wasn't just the heir apparent. He was the primary witness to a deal that required my total erasure as a person. And he was sitting right there in that office, probably checking the stock market on his phone, while my father traded my future for a larger market share. They weren't even angry. They were just efficient. Two businessmen closing a deal over expensive cigars, and I was nothing more than a closing instrument. A piece of equity to be moved from one ledger to another to ensure the Harmon name stayed on the side of every new construction project in the county. The weight of it was so heavy I could feel it in my bones. The realization that the man who had taught me how to ride a bike and told me he was proud of my commissioning ceremony had actually been calculating my market value the entire time I was overseas. I wasn't a daughter to him, and I wasn't even a veteran who had earned her place in the world. I was just a logistics problem that he had finally solved by destroying my professional standing until I had nowhere else to turn. I sat in that dark closet long after the voices in the vent had faded into the sounds of the office janitors starting their shifts, and I looked at the Army JAG complaint in my hand with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins. My father thought he had closed every door and cut every line, believing that a 32-year-old woman with a ruined reputation would eventually realize that her only hope was the wedding ring he had picked out for her. But as I walked out of that basement and into the humid Virginia night, I knew that the only thing my father had actually done was give me the one thing I had been missing: the absolute, gutted certainty that I was no longer his daughter, and that the voicemail I had found on my old phone was the only lifeline I had left to pull. I walked out of that basement and into the humid Virginia night, the smell of damp pavement and exhaust fumes feeling like a weight on my chest as I drove back to the small apartment that had begun to feel more like a transit station than a home. I spent the next 3 hours in a kind of feverish silence, pulling boxes out of the closet and sorting through the fragments of the life I had tried to build before my father decided to tear it down, needing to move, to touch something real, to prove to myself that I still existed outside of his business ledger. I think most of us who have received a phone call or a piece of news that splits our life into before and after know that feeling. When you find a small, physical piece of the past that has been waiting for you to be strong enough to find it. And for me, it was a handwritten recipe card for lemon icebox pie that slipped out of an old Army field manual. It was my grandmother's elegant, looping script. The ink faded, but the words still sharp. And as I held that card, I felt the familiar scent of lavender and black coffee wash over me, a sudden, sharp reminder that the only person who had ever truly known me hadn't left me empty-handed. I was tossing a stack of old bank statements into a shredder bag when I found it, buried at the bottom of a box of unpacked kitchen gear. My old smartphone. The one with the shattered screen and the dead battery that I had replaced right after I got back from my last deployment. I had forgotten to trade it in, and for some reason, standing there in the middle of my living room with the sound of the night traffic buzzing outside, I felt a desperate, irrational need to see what was left on it, to look at the messages from a time when I still believed my military career was the only thing that defined me. I sat on the floor and plugged it into a portable charger, watching the Apple logo flicker to life against the cracks in the glass, a digital survivor from a life that felt 100 years away. When the home screen finally loaded, a flood of missed notifications and old emails scrolled past. But it was the single voicemail from 3 years ago, a message left while I was stationed overseas and my satellite link was down, that made the air in the room go still. The voice that came through the distorted speaker was professional and measured, the voice of a man who dealt in facts and figures rather than rumors and control, identifying himself as Robert Galloway from a law firm in Roanoke. He said he was calling regarding the estate of Eleanor Marsh, and that there were legal instruments and private trust documents that required my immediate attention and a notarized signature before the probate period closed. I played the message 3 times, my heart hammering a rhythm against my ribs that I hadn't felt since my commissioning ceremony, realizing that this call had come in just weeks after we buried her. A call I never received because I was moving between military bases and my father had told me there was nothing left for me to worry about. I sat there in the dark, the cracked screen glowing against my palms, and I realized that my father, Dale Harmon, hadn't just lied about the inheritance. He had ensured that the only person who could have helped me was silenced by a 3-year-old technicality. I didn't wait for the sun to come up before I was at my laptop, searching for the Galloway and Associates listing, only to find that the senior partner had retired a year ago and the firm had been absorbed into a larger Richmond-based practice. I called the new office the moment the clock on my microwave hit 8 a.m., my voice sounding thinner than I wanted it to be, as I explained to the receptionist who I was and why I was calling about a probate file that should have been closed years ago. There was a long silence on the other end, the sound of keyboard clicking and muffled office chatter filling the gap, before she came back on the line with a tone that was suddenly much more cautious. She told me that the file notes indicated multiple attempts were made to reach me, but that a family representative, my father, had eventually contacted them to state that I was emotionally unable to handle the legalities and that I had requested all trust matters be indefinitely suspended. I stood in my kitchen, looking at the unpaid utility bill on the counter, and the only thought I had was that my father had been managing my erasure with the same calculated efficiency he used to close a land development deal. He had told a law firm I was unstable, just like he had told the Army I was a thief, building a wall of legal half-truths around me while I was half a world away, serving a country that he was using as a smokescreen for his own greed. The receptionist told me that because I was now making contact personally, she could release the contact information for the trustee, a man who had apparently been holding a sealed envelope for me for 15 years under my grandmother's explicit instructions. I wrote down the name and the Richmond address with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, realizing that the paper trail I had found in the Caldwell County basement was nothing compared to the ledger my grandmother had started writing before I even knew how to balance a checkbook. I realized then that the silence my grandmother had kept wasn't just a shield. It was a waiting game, a strategic delay designed to ensure that I would only find what she left me when I was old enough to understand why she had to hide it. My father thought he had won by intercepting the voicemails and the legal notices, believing that he could simply outlast the memory of a dead woman's love. But he hadn't accounted for a cracked smartphone in a cardboard box, and a granddaughter who had been trained by the Army to never leave a financial discrepancy unresolved. I looked at the handwritten recipe card one last time before tucking it into my wallet, feeling a cold, sharp surge of determination that told me I wasn't just going to Richmond for a job interview. I was going there to reclaim a legacy that my father had tried to bury under a mountain of property liens and false affidavits. And I knew that the email I had received from Whitfield Capital wasn't a coincidence. It was the first sign that the door my grandmother built was finally starting to swing open. I left Caldwell County on a Tuesday morning, catching a Greyhound bus that smelled of industrial cleaner and exhaust fumes, carrying nothing but a Goodwill suit I had spent 3 hours steaming with a travel iron, and the handwritten recipe card that felt like a commissioned officer's secret orders. I had exactly $47 left in my checking account, just enough for the round-trip ticket to Richmond and a night at a budget motel where the fluorescent lights flickered in the hallway and the mattress sagged with the weight of 1,000 other people's failed dreams. I think most women who have raised a family or managed a household on a shoestring budget know that feeling. When you are counting every penny, when you are sacrificing your own meals just to make sure the utility bill gets paid or the kids have what they need for school, and you realize that no one ever stopped to ask if you're doing okay because you've made being strong look so unremarkable. I spent that night in the motel bathroom, letting the steam from the shower work the last of the wrinkles out of my navy blazer, realizing that for 8 years I had been a captain responsible for government millions, and now I was a woman whose entire future depended on whether I could make a second-hand suit look like corporate leadership. The email from Whitfield Capital had been short and strangely personal, signed by the CEO himself, stating that he had a specific interest in my application and that he wanted to conduct the interview on the 26th floor of their headquarters. I had spent the 4-hour bus ride staring out the window at the Virginia landscape, watching the red clay and pine forests roll past, wondering how a man I had only seen in business journals could possibly know my name, or why he would flag a separated Army officer with a blackened reputation for a personal meeting. I felt like I was walking into another trap, another elaborate humiliation designed by my father to prove that I was nothing without his endorsement. But I had to believe that the voicemail on my old phone was real, and that the trust documents my grandmother had hidden were more than just a sentimental memory. I realized that the sacrifice of leaving Caldwell County, of walking away from the only home I had ever known with $47 and a cracked smartphone, was the first real thing I had done for myself since I took my oath of office at 22. I was standing on the sidewalk outside that 30-story glass building in Richmond the next morning, the city traffic buzzing around me and the reflection of the sun blinding against the steel, when my phone began to vibrate in my hand with a caller I had been dreading since the bus pulled out of the station. It was my father, Dale, and for a split second, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But the old military habit of facing the problem head-on made me slide the screen and put the phone to my ear. His voice was flat and cold, sounding like a closing statement in a real estate lawsuit, telling me that he knew exactly where I was and that he had already made the necessary calls to the executive board at Whitfield Capital. He told me that the finance industry in Virginia was smaller than I thought, that his commercial development contacts reached every corner of the state, and that I should turn around and get back on the bus before I embarrassed the Harmon name any further in a city where people actually valued integrity. My father didn't even wait for me to respond. He simply told me that this was my final warning, that if I walked through those revolving doors, he would ensure that the Army JAG complaint and the theft allegations became a permanent part of my civilian record across the entire mid-Atlantic region. I stood there with the humid city air sticking to my skin, and then my phone buzzed again with a text message from my brother Kevin, a short, gloating line that said, "Enjoy the bus ride home, sis. Dad already finished what you started." I looked up at the towering glass and steel of that building, a monument to a world where my father thought he could buy and sell the truth with a single country club handshake. And I realized that my father wasn't just trying to stop me from getting a job. He was trying to make sure I never believed I was a person of value again. I was standing on a sidewalk outside a 30-story glass building in Richmond with $47 in my wallet and a suit I had steamed in a budget motel bathroom. And my father was on the phone telling me he had already called them, that I should turn around and drive home, that I was wasting the last of whatever dignity I had left. If you have ever stood at a door that might change everything and had to decide whether to walk through it anyway, tell me if you think she made the right call. Like and subscribe. Because what was waiting for me on the 26th floor of that building was something my father had spent 2 years trying to make sure I would never be allowed to find. I took a long, steady breath. The kind of breath I used to take before an official audit or a command briefing, and I silenced my phone before tucking it into my Goodwill blazer, choosing to believe in the silence of my grandmother over the noise of my father's calculated threats. I walked through those revolving doors and across the polished marble lobby, acutely aware of my scuffed heels and the $47 in my pocket, but feeling a strange, quiet power in the fact that I was finally moving toward a door that Dale couldn't lock. The receptionist at the security desk didn't look at me with suspicion or judgment. She simply checked my ID, handed me a visitor's badge, and told me that James Whitfield was expecting me and that I should take the private elevator to the top floor. I watched the digital floor counter rise, 26 floors of silence and gravity, realizing that my father's necessary calls might have already poisoned the air I was about to breathe, but that as a captain in the finance corps, I had been trained to look at the ledger myself before accepting someone else's audit. When the elevator doors slid open, I found myself in a reception area that looked like a gallery of success, with original artwork on the walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the James River, a world away from the basement records office where I had been filing land deeds for minimum wage. An assistant led me down a hallway lined with historical photographs of the firm, stopping at a heavy oak door that looked like it had been standing since the turn of the century, and she told me to go right in, with a smile that was surprisingly warm. I pushed the door open and saw a man standing by the window, his back to me, looking out at the city of Richmond with the posture of someone who had spent his life keeping difficult promises. He turned slowly, and I saw that James Whitfield wasn't holding a job application or an HR file. He was holding a yellowed, wax-sealed envelope with my name written on it in my grandmother's elegant, looping hand. James handed me the envelope, the wax seal cracking under my thumb like the dry earth of Caldwell County in mid-August. And as I pulled out the notarized stock certificate and the leather-bound journal, I felt the entire architecture of my father's lies finally begin to collapse. The certificate stated that my grandmother, Eleanor Marsh, had placed an 8% founding stake of Whitfield Capital Group in my name when I was only 6 years old. A legally irrevocable trust that had grown in the dark for 26 years until it was worth approximately $2.4 million. James told me that my grandmother was the first person who ever wrote him a check when he was a nobody with a business plan and no commercial credit, and that she had made him promise that if her granddaughter ever came looking for a job, he would give her the keys to the firm she helped build. I sat in that leather chair and opened the journal, finding entry after entry, documenting how my father, Dale, had been intercepting the birthday and holiday checks my grandmother sent me for a decade, depositing them into Harmon accounts I never saw, and how he had even attempted to have himself named executor of her estate 2 months before she died to bury this trust forever. Anyone who has watched an older person get older knows the quiet dignity they carry even when the people around them are trying to erase their worth. And as I read my grandmother's words, I realized that she had been fighting a silent war for my future long before I ever put on a commissioned officer's uniform. I think most women who have raised a family know this feeling. You see exactly what's happening. You've seen it for years, and you stay quiet because you're building a door that your children can walk through once you're gone. I agreed to attend the Whitfield Charity Gala in Richmond that Friday night, not because I wanted to see my father suffer, but because I was tired of being the only one in Caldwell County who knew the truth about the woman who had really built our family's foundation. I watched from the top of the marble staircase as my father and my brother Kevin worked the room, Dale leaning in to whisper to potential investors while my brother checked the billable hours on his phone, both of them believing they were about to close a development deal that would merge our family firm with the rival developers from the vent conversation. When James took the stage and introduced me not as a separated Army officer with a blackened name, but as a founding shareholder and the newest senior analyst at Whitfield Capital, the room went as still as the air before a Virginia thunderstorm. My father's face went from a charcoal gray to a deep purple as he pushed through the crowd, screaming that I was a thief and that the JAG complaint he had filed was proof I couldn't be trusted. But his words were just noise in a room where the CEO was already naming the facts of his estate fraud and his blacklisting scheme. My father, Dale, lost the state development contracts that were the lifeblood of his company, and his seat on the regional bank board was revoked within 48 hours of the gala. Harmon Commercial Properties was forced into a federal audit that exposed years of predatory commercial leases, and my brother found that the Harmon name on his resume was now a stain that no amount of billable hours could ever clean. I have a quiet house in Roanoke now, 3 blocks from the old Marsh Regional Supply warehouse, and a savings account that provides the kind of security my father always used as a leash. My grandmother's name is back on the head of the family table in Charleston, where it belongs. And the first time I saw her photo in the Whitfield lobby, I had to stop, because I finally understood that she had never left me alone. My father paid with the public reputation he spent 30 years building, while I only had to lose the 2 years I spent proving his lies were nothing more than expensive noise. I spent so long waiting for a man who didn't love me to give me permission to exist that I forgot to look at the woman I had already become in the Army Finance Corps. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and like and subscribe, because there is always someone sitting quietly in a house somewhere right now, holding something painful they have never said out loud. And maybe this is the story that helps them understand they are not alone. I have my coffee on the back porch every morning now, in the same handcrafted rocking chair my grandmother used. And the only sounds I hear are the ones I choose to let in. The birds, the neighbor's dog, the wind in the Virginia pines. And I am not afraid of what the phone might say.